Well, we've dashed through European art from the Renaissance to Rodin. Before we dive into modernism and postmodernism, we're going to look at our last major category of non-Western art, the art of the Americas. And we're going to approach this unit the way we did Africa and the Pacific. Today, I will try to identify some big themes in each of the three major regions, Mesoamerica, Andean South America, and indigenous North America. Then you get to introduce these cultures and lead a discussion of our required works. I'm not going to read these slides, you already have the handout, but a few words of advice. Do not try to give us a full encyclopedia account of your culture. Instead, think about the themes that tend to show up in art and on the AP Art History exam. What is the culture's religion, its beliefs and practices, and how does art and architecture both reflect and promote this religion? Who is in power, and how does art reinforce that power and authority? What is the social structure, including the family structure and the role of women? And how is this social structure represented in art? What is the culture's natural environment, and how does this affect the content of its art? What kind of materials are available to this culture, and what kind of social or religious significance does their use convey? Again, you have a handout. Be careful to select questions from different categories to create variety in your presentation and to protect your grade. I'm not going to reproduce the full cultural context essay question list here. Again, you have a handout. What you want to keep in mind as you prepare essay answers is that your analysis needs to include at least as much information about the culture as it does about the work. Earlier in the year, I shared the comments from the chief reader of the AP exam, who observed that students tended to score pretty well on visual description and analysis, but much more poorly on cultural context. Run faster than those other deer. So what I'd like to do now is give a very brief introduction to these cultures, providing more detail is your job, and tease out some of the important themes that we will explore in this unit. Well, I haven't made much secret of my irritation with the College Board's proliferating, enduring understandings and essential knowledges. I find them wordy and not always well connected to the images. But as you're about to bombard yourselves and each other with information about these cultures, it's smart to hone in on the themes that tie the works of the region together and clue us into what the College Board wants us all to learn. As you prepare your presentations, I'd encourage you to look at the College Board Content Area Description for Art of the Americas. It's up on Moodle. Here is a very busy summary list of enduring understandings for the unit. I think you'll see many parallels with themes we explored when looking at the art of Africa and the Pacific. I'll just throw out a few comparisons. What do these works obviously have in common? And what else would you guess they might have in common? Well, what's obvious is they're both made of feathers, colorful, exotic, and difficult to attain. But they also carry with them the imagery of birds, their ability to fly, their keen eyesight, their viewpoint high above the land and closer to the gods. Religion and nature are closely intertwined in these Pacific and American cultures. The multiple colors of the Aztec headdress also attest to the empire's widespread trading network, since the birds that supplied the feathers came from different regions of Mesoamerica. So what do you remember about the work on the left? And what would you guess it might have in common with the work on the right, a Mexica or Aztec codex? Well, both of these works use iconography and the careful placement of materials or images to tell a story about history of ruling dynasties and reconquest. What is the work on the bottom from an earlier unit, and what it might have in common with the Inca images on top? These are both royal residences. What do you notice about the differences in the way stone is worked? Both architectural complexes use dressed, that is, carved and shaped stone, but Great Zimbabwe stones are largely regular, whereas the Inca stones are fit together like an elaborate but irregular jigsaw puzzle. The fit is amazingly close, and yet it allows enough wiggle room to help the building survive earthquakes. Some of the original walls in Cuzco's central temple were revealed when an earthquake brought down large sections of a Baroque church built over the site, yet left the Inca stone standing. What seems like an oddly random pattern of stones may in fact serve an important structural purpose. Some scholars also speculate that the irregular shapes and very tight way that they're fit together make a political point. The Inca have brought a diverse group of people into a tightly controlled empire where each part contributes labor and materials and in turn receives protection. Note that this Maya site shows another stoneworking technique. The top of this Maya temple is called a roof comb. So what's one functional advantage of building up this way? Well, the space between stones lightens the walls and enables them to go higher. One of the works I consulted described the roof comb this way. These are like fancy headdresses for buildings, increasing their apparent height, proclaiming power, and grabbing attention. And I'd note that headdresses feature prominently in the ruling elite's wardrobes as well. Mesoamerican cultures did not use the arch. Their basic architectural structure was post and lintel. They also did not use columns, even though carved stelae or pillars were very important historical and artistic documentation of rulers. So what effect would this structural, that is post and lintel approach have on the interior? Well, buildings constructed this way would necessarily be small and dark, inner sanctums for gods, rather like the garbhagriha of a Hindu temple. Elaborate public ceremonies, religious and political combined, would take place outside the temples, which is easy in warm climates. Remember that this was true of Greek temples as well. What might these two works have in common? By the way, I apologize, I have a cold. The work on the left should give you a clue. Both works convey a ruler's status. What's especially intriguing about the work on the right, the Mayan work on the right, is that a woman, a ruler's wife, is helping reinforce her husband's status through an elaborate vision that comes from ritual bloodletting. Stay tuned. Can you think of another work from our Africa unit that showcases the important role wives play in supporting rulers? I find it intriguing that in the Yoruba work, the senior wife is actually portrayed as larger than the king. So what similarity might I be getting at here? These works are both examples of art used in performance. What do you remember about the Aka elephant mask? It was used in a special dance and signified a divine king who could transform into an elephant. The transformation mask on the left, that was worn by the Kwakiutl people of northwest coast of Canada, was also worn over the head as part of a complete body costume. During a ritual performance, the wearer opens and closes the mask, revealing the face of an ancestor. Remember shamanism, or connection with the spirit world through transformation into an animal or spirit? It's a common theme in much art of the indigenous Americas, and it's a favorite College Board topic. So here are a couple more summary slides. In earlier units, we've seen many architectural works oriented to the cardinal directions. Think of pyramids, for example. But in the art of the Americas, the center is often just as important spatially as north, south, east, or west. Think of the axis mundi, another concept we've encountered before, an axis that connects Earth with the underworld and with the heavens. In the art of the Americas, the spirit world is likewise often subterranean, with tunnels and caves connecting the everyday world to the abodes of the gods and spirits. So any guess about a parallel I'm drawing here? The work on the bottom right should be a big hint. Many cultures use art and architecture to provide astronomical guides that celebrate the cycle of life and signal times to plant and harvest. The art of Mesoamerica in particular developed the calendar to a high art. The work on the left is actually a calendar in stone. Note, too, how often the art of the Americas combines animal and human images, which may attest to shamanistic rituals of transformation and may associate human rulers and or gods with the power and attributes of animals. So what do you remember about the jade Kong? The face seems to have both human and animal features. This is a prehistoric work, so we just have to guess, but I'm struck that these faces are surprisingly similar to works that appear in the art of the Americas. I'm not suggesting a physical connection, just a similarity. The ceramic figure on the bottom, which is not a required work, depicts the Mexica or Aztec god Tlaloc, the god of rain and earthly fertility. One way that form sometimes reinforces this message of transformation so central to shamanism is a technique known as contour rivalry. An image can be viewed as depicting one thing when viewed in a certain way, but if the image is flipped or turned, the same lines that form the previous image now make up an entirely new design. Here's an example from the Andean culture of Chavan de Huantar, which frequently used this technique. By contrast, note that the jade Kong was designed so that the design persisted even when the object was turned over. The Chinese were very big on continuity. Contour rivalry in the art of Americas signals transformation or change. So you'll get lots of information about politics in the individual cultural presentations. The point I want to make here is that we will encounter significant differences in political structure in this unit. The Aztecs and Inca created large empires through military conquest and elaborate networks of tribute and trade. Mayan city-states traded and warred with each other, but like the Greeks, before Philip and Alexander, they were organized into rival city-states. In North America, we see no empires, although there's a great deal we don't know about the earlier Anasazi and Hopewell cultures. But none of these societies practiced separation of church and state. Political power always reinforced spiritual authority and vice versa, especially in Mesoamerica. Rulers were tied to each society's creation story very explicitly. And with that, I'm going to move on to the three big geographical cultural areas: Mesoamerica, Andean, South America, and, much more briefly, North America. So let's start with the area usually called Mesoamerica, areas we now know as Mexico and Central America. We're going to look at two sites. Yaxchilan, on the border between Mexico and Guatemala, encircled here in purple, was one of many Mayan city-states. This one reached its height in the 8th century, which is during what archaeologists call the Mayan Classic period. Tenochtitlan, circled in red, is the Aztec capital and is now Mexico City. The Aztec Empire was at its height in the early 16th century when Tenochtitlan was captured by Spanish conquistador Hernan Cortez. Just to make our lives more confusing, one of the works from Tenochtitlan is actually a prized artifact from a much earlier culture. We're talking 1200 to 400 BCE. That culture is the Olmec, whose center was east and south of the Aztec capital, and I've circled that area in blue. For this work, we will need to consider both how the work reflects Olmec culture, what we know of it, but also why it was so highly prized by the Aztecs that they placed it in their central temple. Let me just note that their proximity notwithstanding, the Maya and Aztec cultures developed in very different geographical settings. Aztec territory was Mexico's high, dry central plain. The Mayan city-states were built in what today is mostly rainforest, and reclaiming those sites from the jungle is one of archaeologists' many challenges. This great diversity notwithstanding, there are certain characteristics that we see across Mesoamerican cultures, in part because they influenced each other, both across time and across geographical space. You can find all of this in the curriculum description. I'm just giving a brief overview of themes you should focus on in your presentations. Again, I don't plan to preempt the presentation, so consider this a teaser. The Olmec culture had a highly stratified society with hereditary roles and a priestly class. These colossal ruler portraits are not a required work, but they're probably the culture's most famous artifacts, and it's thought that they portray rulers rather than deity. Why? Well, the features seem more individual than generic, suggesting these may have been real people, except that is for the green statue, which is a jaguar human. Again, many of these cultures created images of creatures that were both man and beast. And what might that say about these cultures' religions and their relationship to nature? This culture, which flourished in the north of today's Mexico City, has fallen off our list, but I want to mention it briefly since the Aztecs knew these pyramids well and were influenced by their construction. At its peak, around 600 CE, this city may have had as many as 200,000 residents, which would have made it the 6th largest city in the world at the time. So why do cultures build pyramids? These people would have had no contact with the Sumerians of ziggurat fame or with the Egyptian pharaohs. Well, pyramids reach for the heavens. They're also a relatively easy shape to build since a heavier, wider bottom supports and distributes weight, and they look like mountains. One thing we do know is that archaeologists found lots of human skeletons, especially children, buried at the four corners of the pyramid's tiers. Why might children be sacrifices, and why four corners? I suspect many of you have visited Mayan ruins. I've been to about 2/3 of the ruins listed here, including the spectacular site of Copan in Honduras. Put it on your list. Remember that the Mayans lived in separate city-states. They never developed a central empire. You're going to hear about Mayan works from just one of these sites, and I'm actually going to show you some Mayan works that aren't on the list, but tell us interesting things about that culture. What great temples do people build in the 20th and 21st centuries, places where mass ceremonies of bloody sacrifice are performed? Yep, football stadiums. And this is, in fact, a ball court, but this ball game makes the NFL look sissy. Most ball games were recreational, but at least some ended in human sacrifice. We don't have any ball court-related works, which seems a shame, but I thought I'd talk a little bit about it because it sheds so much light on Mesoamerican culture. These cultures saw the ball and its movement in the court as paralleling the movement of the heavenly bodies in the sky. The game was viewed as a battle between the sun against the moon and stars, representing the principles of lightness and darkness. If a particular game had religious meaning, the losing team could be sacrificed, or maybe the winning team. Archaeologists are still arguing about which one got sacrificed. In illustrations from pre-Columbian books and on carved stone friezes decorating the walls of Mayan ball courts, like the one you see here, we see one team captain, sometimes a priest, decapitating the other team captain. One of the most important episodes in the Popol Vuh, or Mayan creation myth, mentions two sets of important Mayan gods going down into the underworld to contest with the gods of the underworld. Afterwards, they are killed and transformed into celestial bodies. The Aztec creation myth likewise involves the gods sacrificing themselves to force the sun to move and to produce time and history. These sacrifices were reenacted in public ceremonies, but I thought you'd find it interesting that some of these ceremonies involved hard rubber balls. And burly guys. Here's one of the many sculptures of Mayan ball players. Note the protective dress. Those rubber balls were very, very hard. Our image set includes only one pyramid from the Templo Mayor, and it's an imaginative reconstruction, not an actual architectural site. But pyramids were a major feature of Mesoamerican art. Here's what the College Board course description has to say. Mesoamerican pyramids began as early earthworks, changed to a 9-level structure with single temples. If you count the levels here, you'll see there are 9. And then later became structures with twin temples. That's the move from Maya to Aztec. So here's our required image, which again is a reconstruction drawing. Note that the Mesoamerican pyramids were usually step pyramids with temples on top, more akin to the ziggurats of Mesopotamia than the pyramids of ancient Egypt. But they did serve as burial structures as well as platforms for ceremonials performed in the temples, high up where the crowds assembling in the plazas could see them. The stairs played an especially interesting role in the Templo Mayor. Stay tuned. If you have time, this History Channel clip gives a good introduction to the Mayan pyramids that don't appear on our list. We also don't have any Mayan murals on the list, but this is one of the most famous, from Bonampak in the Chiapas province of Mexico. Note that the sacrifice is taking place at the top of a step pyramid. But it wasn't just captives whose blood was shed. Here we see the king performing a bloodletting ceremony before battle. The ancient Maya used spines from stingrays and cacti, as well as obsidian knives, to pierce their ears, tongues, and genitals to spill their own blood for sacrifice. Sorry, guys. Blood from the penis was especially valued. Any guesses why? Women of the royal family also performed these rituals. This carved image is part of a grouping with our required image. Our required image shows the vision the queen has after the bloodletting. Note that the Mayan carved murals combined writing and images. And just to show you that the Maya culture wasn't all about ball games and blood, here's a mural depicting musicians. Well, I'm skipping over several important Mesoamerican cultures and coming to the Aztecs. This culture actually rather creeped out its Spanish conquerors. Do you remember why? On the right, we see the moon goddess being dismembered. I'll leave the presenter to tell the story and to explain what we can learn about Aztec culture from this image. On the left, we see a beheaded goddess with serpents coming out of the stump of her neck and another emerging from between her legs. Death and new life merge. And what does that suggest about Aztec culture? This and the following set of works are from a temple commemorating the god's victory over his sister and 400 brothers. It would be interesting to draw a comparison between this and the founding myth of the Greek pantheon, which also involved interfamily killings. Well, there's obviously a lot more I could say about Mesoamerica, but we need to move on to South America, and especially the cultures that emerged in western South America along the Andes. Actually, this area has a complex ecosystem that includes desert plains near the ocean, different levels of mountain microclimate, and the rainforest to the east. Many of the religious traditions in the Andes actually come from the Amazon. Widespread trading connected these regions under the Inca Empire. I'm running out of time, but just a few comments. Note the critical role of textiles, and therefore of women, in Andean art. Textiles often imitate art in other cultures, but in Andean America, art often imitates textile design. Textile designs tend to be geometric and linear, partly because artists were working with low thread count, heavy wool, and cotton, which are harder to work into nonlinear designs. Finally, note that the mythology draws heavily on jaguars, eagles, and serpents, which some archaeologists identify as an Amazonian cosmology adopted by cultures far from the Amazon. This work is not on the AP list, which baffles me a little since it seems to be the most famous Chauvin artifact. Let me just note that the figures on the stela are once again composites. They combine feline, avian, reptilian, and human features. This fanged beast shows up all over South America across hundreds of years. Again, there's some recent evidence that the image actually originated in the Amazon basin. Note again the geometrical and highly stylized forms. Back to South America and the civilization of the Incas. They were above all extraordinary architects and engineers. I visited Machu Picchu a few years ago. We hiked in, and this was the view we saw as we arrived in one of the sacred gates at around 3 in the afternoon. Here are a few more Inca works. Note the meticulous work in precious metals and the complex geometric patterns in the textiles. Okay, now I really have run out of time, and we're also getting to cultures that will mostly be represented by one work and one presenter. But you should see some similar themes emerging. The portrayal of ritual, shamanistic transformation of men into man-beasts, artistic depictions of history, and elaborate public architecture designed to promote spiritual and political unity. Here's the College Board's list of themes, and again, these are all reproduced in your workbooks. And this is more than enough for now. Good luck with your presentations. We are getting closer to the finish line.